On April 18th, 2026, a quiet river gauge in Shiocton, Wisconsin, recorded 15.05 feet, shattering a benchmark that had stood for years. Yesterday's events did not happen in isolation. What unfolded across multiple states on that single calendar date is something you need to understand in full, because the Wolf River was only the beginning. Stay with me, because by the time we get to the end of this, what you understand about that Wisconsin river gauge is going to be completely different from what you think right now. Let's start with the mechanics of what built this situation, because that is where the mainstream coverage always falls short. They will show you the water in the streets, they will interview the homeowner with the ruined basement, and then they will move on to sports or traffic. What they will not do is walk you backward through the atmospheric machinery that produced all of this simultaneously, in multiple states, across multiple hazard categories, in a way that should deeply concern anyone paying attention. Go back 48 hours from April 18th. There was a major severe weather outbreak on April 17th, the kind of event that produces tornado warnings, significant hail, widespread wind damage across the central and southern United States. That outbreak did not simply end. It doesn't work that way. A system of that scale carries momentum. It drags its energy eastward. It leaves behind destabilized air masses, saturated ground, and exhausted emergency response infrastructure. What happened on April 18th was not a new storm. It was the trailing edge, the long, grinding tail of a multi-day atmospheric event that had already been chewing through communities for days, and that tail still had teeth. Down in East Texas on April 18th, that trailing storm line cut an 8 to 10 mile wide hail swath, a corridor of ice pellets ranging from pea-size to nickel size, dragging across western Henderson County and then pushing into Tyler County, Gregg County, and Rusk County. Wind gusts were recorded up to 60 miles per hour. Now, nickel-sized hail at 60 miles per hour does not sound dramatic on paper. Nobody was injured. The damage was described as minor. The local news probably gave it 90 seconds. But here is what matters and what gets missed. This was not an isolated afternoon thunderstorm that popped up on a hot day. This was a storm system that had already been demanding resources from emergency services for over 24 hours across multiple states before it even arrived in East Texas. Every fire truck that had to respond, every road crew deployed to clear debris, every 911 dispatcher who had been working a double shift since the day before. That is the real damage that doesn't appear in the property loss estimates. And while East Texas was getting pelted, simultaneously on the same calendar date, the Great Lakes region was experiencing something categorically different and arguably far more concerning in terms of its duration and reach. This is the convergence that nobody is drawing lines between. The Muskegon River in Michigan reached major flood stage on April 18th. Not moderate flood stage, major. This came on the back of record April rainfall combined with snowmelt, a combination that hydrologists treat with particular seriousness, because snowmelt doesn't care about your drainage infrastructure. It follows gravity. It fills the water table from beneath, while rainfall saturates it from above, and when both are happening simultaneously, rivers don't just rise, they surge. The Muskegon was falling by evening, which is the one piece of good news in this picture, but it remained elevated with widespread lowland flooding affecting roads and basements across nearby communities. Now hold that in your mind. The Muskegon River, major flood stage, Michigan. Move southwest into Wisconsin, and you find not one but 3 separate river flooding events on the same date. The Fox River in Waukesha, the Wolf River, and the cascading strain on emergency management across more than 20 Wisconsin counties simultaneously under flood warnings, 20 counties in one state on one day. The Fox River situation in Waukesha is significant on its own. Roads affected, parks inundated, low-lying areas damaged, ongoing monitoring required. But it almost becomes a footnote when you position it next to what the Wolf River was doing 30 miles to the north. Shiocton, Wisconsin, population under 1,000 people. A quiet river town that most Americans could not find on a map without help. On April 18th, the Wolf River crested at 15.05 feet at the Shiocton gauge. The record that had previously stood at that location was 14.1 feet. You don't break a record by nearly a full foot without something serious happening upstream. That requires sustained, heavy rainfall across the entire watershed, feeding that river, rain that doesn't stop, that doesn't give the ground time to absorb, that just keeps pushing water downhill towards Shiocton until the gauge is reading numbers nobody has ever seen before. Downstream at New London, the river hit 11.91 feet, clearing the previous record of 11.83 feet. Evacuations were underway, roads were closed, and the local emergency management teams were not dealing with this as a single event. They were managing it simultaneously with the Fox River flooding, simultaneously with the Muskegon situation in Michigan, simultaneously with the aftermath of the April 17th outbreak to their south and west. That is what a strained emergency system actually looks like. It is not a single dramatic disruption. It is 10 moderate disruptions arriving at the same time, all demanding the same finite pool of personnel, equipment, and decision-making capacity. Now here is where I want to pause and tease something that we're going to come back to before the end of this. The geomagnetic storm, the G2, that KP index of 6, registered on April 18th through the 19th. I am not going to bury the headline on that. I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as we work through the rest of what happened on these dates. Because when we circle back to it, you are going to see a layer of systemic vulnerability that has nothing to do with rain or wind or river gauges, and everything to do with the infrastructure that emergency management depends on to function at all. Let's move to fire, because while Wisconsin and Michigan were drowning, other parts of the country were burning, or rather, sitting on the edge of burning. Critical fire weather conditions, level 2 and level 3, developed across portions of the southeast and the high plains on April 18th into the 19th. Relative humidity below 30%, wind gusts of 15 to 25 miles per hour, fuels that were already primed and dry from drought conditions. Level 3 critical fire weather is not a casual designation. That is the Storm Prediction Center telling you that if an ignition occurs under these conditions, a downed power line, a tossed cigarette, a lawnmower blade hitting a rock, the fire that follows will spread fast and it will be difficult to control. And when that risk is sitting on top of a drought-stressed landscape that has been baking for weeks, you do not need a catastrophic start to get an extraordinary outcome. The reported fire activity on that date was relatively light, a few new starts, nothing that made national headlines. But the absence of a major incident is not the absence of danger. It is luck, and luck is not a fire management strategy. The combination of low humidity, breezy conditions, and drought-dried fuels across the southeastern high plains, while the Midwest was simultaneously flooding, is the kind of geographic split screen that should make any serious analyst stop and recognize that the United States was operating across multiple simultaneous hazard theaters on April 18th with no reserve capacity to spare. Now let's talk temperature, because it was doing something strange on these dates. Something that, on the surface, might seem almost pleasant, but which tells a more complicated story when you look at it through the right lens. Across the eastern United States on April 18th and into the 19th, temperatures were running 15 to 20 degrees above average in places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Highs in the 70s and 80s in mid-April. Some people opened their windows, some people probably thought it felt like early summer. But thermodynamically, what that warmth was doing was feeding the atmospheric instability that was driving the storm system still rolling through the southern and central states. Warm, moist air at the surface is the fuel that severe thunderstorm systems feed on. It is not a pleasant warmth when it is occurring simultaneously with a multi-day severe weather outbreak. It is the accelerant. And then, almost immediately behind that warmth, a cold front drove temperatures down 20 to 30 degrees within a 24-hour window across the Great Lakes and Northeast. Frost risks, lows dropping into the 30s and 40s after the flood peaks. This is the part that the recovery workers in Wisconsin and Michigan had to deal with. Not just high water, but a cold snap arriving while their communities were still wet, while roads were still blocked, while some residents were still unable to return to homes that had been touched by that record flooding. A frost event on top of flood recovery is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. Wet insulation loses its effectiveness. Exposed pipes that survived the flooding become vulnerable to a rapid freeze. Infrastructure that was already stressed by water now faces a thermal shock. This is how compound hazards actually cause damage. not always through dramatic individual maxima, but through relentless sequential punishment of systems and communities that have no time to recover between events. Now, the geomagnetic storm. A G2 moderate geomagnetic storm, driven by a coronal hole high-speed stream, was active on April 18th through April 19th, 2026. KP index of 6, NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center had issued watches in advance, which is good. The aurora was visible at mid-latitudes, which is the piece that makes it onto social media. But the part that matters for the purposes of this conversation, the part that nobody in the mainstream reporting connected to the terrestrial situation, is the potential for minor power grid fluctuations and degraded GPS accuracy. Think about that carefully in context. On April 18th, Wisconsin had 20 counties under flood warnings. Evacuations were active. Emergency management teams were coordinating across county lines, relying on communication infrastructure, GPS navigation for rescue assets, and electrical grid stability for 911 dispatch centers and command posts. At the exact same moment, the Earth's magnetic field was being compressed by a solar wind stream energetic enough to push the KP index to 6. G2 events have documented effects on high-frequency radio communications, the kind that emergency responders in rural areas sometimes fall back on when cell towers are overwhelmed or damaged. GPS signal accuracy can degrade. Satellite links can experience interference. Does a G2 storm single-handedly bring down emergency communications? No, but in a system that is already stressed, in a state where emergency managers are already stretched across 20 simultaneous flood events, where responders are already fatigued from a multi-day outbreak, a minor degradation in communication reliability is not minor at all. It is the last thing you want. And it was happening, quietly, in the background, while the rivers were rising and the hail was falling and the fire weather was building to the southwest. This is what systemic stress looks like from above. Not one extraordinary failure, a dozen moderate stresses arriving in parallel, each one manageable in isolation, collectively overwhelming the buffers we rely on to keep communities safe. The seismic picture on these dates adds one more thread, though a quieter one. A magnitude 2.8 earthquake struck 15 kilometers south of Volcano, Hawaii, on April 19th. Routine seismic activity near Kilauea. Nothing unusual for that volcanic environment. No unrest reported. And a magnitude 3.2 quake registered near Silver Springs, Nevada, on April 18th. A lightly populated area, no damage. On any other day, these would not be worth mentioning in the same breath as anything else. But on a day where emergency monitoring systems across the country were already tasked at capacity with flood, fire, and storm events, even minor seismic activity requires sensor reads, alert processing, and personnel time. None of it is free. All of it draws from the same finite pool. So let's step back now and look at the full picture of April 18th, 2026. Because I want you to really sit with what was happening simultaneously on that single calendar date. A severe thunderstorm line cutting through East Texas, the leftover tail of a major outbreak that had already exhausted regional response capacity. Record flood levels on the Wolf River in Wisconsin, shattering gauges that had stood for years. Major flood stage on the Muskegon River in Michigan. Significant flooding on the Fox River in Waukesha. Over 20 Wisconsin counties simultaneously under flood warning, with evacuations active and roads closed. Critical fire weather at level 2 and level 3 across the southeastern high plains, with drought-dried fuels waiting for a spark. A G2 geomagnetic storm quietly degrading the communications infrastructure that all of the above depended on to coordinate response. Temperatures 15 to 20 degrees above normal in the east, feeding the atmospheric instability driving the storm systems, followed immediately by a 20 to 30 degree cold snap, arriving on top of flooded, exhausted communities, and minor seismic events in Nevada and Hawaii adding to the monitoring load. This is not a day of extreme weather, this is a day of nationwide hazard saturation, and that distinction matters enormously because systems designed to handle one major event at a time, which is most of them, simply do not scale to this pattern. The resources are not there, the personnel are not there, and these patterns, the multi-day outbreak that refuses to end, the simultaneous river records falling in multiple states, the fire weather building on the other side of the country while the Midwest drowns, these patterns are not random noise. They are what happens when atmospheric systems operate in an environment that no longer behaves the way the infrastructure responding to it was designed to handle. The Wolf River at Geomagnetic, 15.05 feet. We started there, and I want you to end there too. Not because that single number is the most dramatic thing that happened on April 18th, 2026, but because it represents something that I keep watching happen again and again across different regions, different river systems, different hazard categories. Records fall. The previous benchmarks were set in different conditions. The new benchmarks are being written by conditions that are harder, more persistent and more simultaneous than what the old infrastructure and the old emergency frameworks were built to handle. If that concerns you, if you think the broader picture here deserves more sustained attention than a 90-second local news segment, then this is exactly the kind of channel you should be subscribed to. Hit that button. Because we are not here to cover weather events after the fact and move on. We are here to watch the patterns, track the convergences, and make sure that when the next multi-day outbreak starts building, and it will, you already understand the architecture of what it is doing before it fully arrives. Leave me a comment on this one. I want to know, looking at what happened across Wisconsin on April 18th alone, the Wolf River, the Fox River, 20 counties simultaneously, evacuations active while a geomagnetic storm was interfering with communications. Do you think local and state emergency management has the capacity to handle that level of convergence? Or are we watching systems that are structurally outmatched by what is now a recurring pattern? Tell me what you think. I read these, and I will see you in the next one.